The streets of ancient Rome were full of life, markets buzzing, senators parading in togas, gossip, passing from one household to the next. But under all that grandeur was a city ready to destroy anyone who stepped out of line. And for women, that danger was constant. In a society that worshipped order and discipline, women were expected to be obedient daughters, dutiful wives, and silent participants in their own lives. But when a woman broke the rules, Rome made an example of her, in ways that still make historians shudder. Imagine being accused of adultery in Rome. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a death sentence delivered in the most humiliating way possible. Adulterous wives weren't simply divorced. They could be stripped naked, paraded through the streets, whipped in public while their neighbors watched, and then cast out of their homes with no legal protection. Some accounts suggest the husband had the right to kill the man involved on the spot. But his wife, she was punished slowly, painfully, as a warning to every other woman who might think of betraying her husband's honor. But public humiliation was just the beginning. Rome specialized in punishments that broke the spirit as well as the body. Some women were forced to watch their own children executed before being put to death themselves, the ultimate psychological torture. Others were subjected to the poena cullae, the horrific punishment usually reserved for parricides, where the condemned was sewn into a sack with live animals, a snake, a dog, a rooster, and thrown into a river. While this was rare for women, records suggest that in certain cases of extreme betrayal, the Senate approved it as a punishment for wives accused of conspiring against their own families. The thought of being clawed and bitten to death in total darkness while drowning was meant to terrify every Roman matron into obedience. Even crimes that seem small today, like drinking wine, could once bring brutal consequences. In early Rome, a woman caught drinking was thought to be committing an act as shameful as adultery. Some sources say that a husband could kill his wife if he caught her with wine, and in other accounts, women were beaten publicly for it. The Romans feared that alcohol would make women bold, uncontrollable, even sexually promiscuous, so they used fear and pain to keep them sober. And then there were the punishments designed not just to kill, but to erase the very memory of the woman who defied Roman order. The dreaded damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, could be applied to women accused of treason or sedition. Their names were struck from official records, their statues smashed, their portraits defaced. It was a second death, one meant to strip them of existence itself. For Romans, being forgotten was worse than dying, because it meant no one would honor your soul in the afterlife. The message was clear. A woman who disobeyed was not just disloyal to her husband, she was an enemy of Rome, and Rome was merciless to its enemies. The most terrifying fate a Roman woman could face was reserved for those who were supposed to be the most sacred, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses were chosen as little girls and sworn to 30 years of chastity, a vow that Rome believed kept the city safe. If a Vestal broke that vow, it wasn't just considered a personal sin. It was seen as a threat to the survival of the entire empire, and the punishment for that crime was designed to be as haunting as possible. The condemned Vestal wasn't simply executed in the forum like an ordinary criminal. No, her death had to be bloodless, because spilling the blood of a priestess was taboo. Instead, she was taken to a chamber deep underground, given a tiny lamp, a bed, and a small amount of food and water, and then the entrance was sealed shut. She would slowly suffocate in total darkness, her body left to rot in the earth beneath Rome. To the Romans, this was a grim compromise. They weren't technically killing her, but they were burying her alive. Every citizen knew that somewhere beneath their feet, a once revered woman was dying alone, a chilling reminder of what happened to those who failed in their sacred duty. But this wasn't the only punishment that played on fear more than pain. Roman noblewomen accused of treason or conspiracy could be forced to take their own lives rather than face a public trial. Suicide was not considered an escape. It was a sentence carried out with precision. A husband or relative might hand the condemned woman a dagger or a cup of poison and watch to make sure she did what was required. In some cases, the property of the accused was confiscated whether she lived or died, making the punishment extend to her entire family. The Romans loved to make punishment generational. A single woman's crime could ruin her children, strip them of inheritance, and leave them disgraced for life. Then, there were the arena punishments. While we often think of gladiator fights as the center of Roman entertainment, the Colosseum also staged gruesome executions. Women condemned for serious crimes, especially those accused of sorcery, murder, or rebelling against Rome, might be thrown to wild beasts in front of tens of thousands of spectators. These weren't quick deaths. The condemned might be tied to stakes or forced to fight wild animals barehanded. The crowd would cheer as lions tore into them, turning their final moments into public spectacle. Roman writers sometimes described these deaths with unsettling glee, as though the pain was part of the moral lesson. See what happens when a woman forgets her place. And still, some punishments were even more sadistic. Records tell of women being burned alive, not as an execution method for a single crime, but as a warning to others. In certain periods of the Republic, mass burnings of women accused of poisoning their husbands were ordered by the Senate. The flames would light up the night sky, sending a message to every Roman household. Obedience was survival. The cruelty was never random. Each punishment had meaning, a twisted form of theater meant to reinforce the state's control over women's bodies, their sexuality, and their choices. And the most frightening part is how effective it was. Roman women lived their entire lives with these punishments hanging over them like a sword, a constant reminder that one wrong move could end not only their life, but their family's honor. What made Roman punishment so uniquely horrifying wasn't just the physical pain. It was the psychological warfare. The state knew that a single death could be turned into a public message, and nowhere was this clearer than in how women were punished. In many cases, the punishment didn't end with the woman's death. It spread like poison through her family, her children, and her name for generations. When a woman of high rank was accused of adultery, for example, the emperor might not even need to put her on trial. Her husband could be forced to divorce her publicly, denounce her as an adulteress before the Senate, and watch her property stripped away. If she was banished to a remote island, a common sentence, she would be cut off from everyone she knew, her letters censored, her freedom gone forever. These islands were desolate, wind-beaten places where food was scarce and escape was impossible. To the Romans, this was worse than death. It was social death, the slow erasure of someone's place in the world. Even when the punishment was physical, it was often staged to humiliate. Women accused of treason, rebellion, or poisoning could be paraded through the streets before their execution, stripped of jewelry and fine clothing, forced to wear rags as the crowd jeered. This wasn't just about killing them. It was about breaking them in spirit before the end. And then there was the weaponization of sexual violence. In the arenas, some women were punished not simply by death, but by being forced to reenact mythological punishments from Roman legends. Writers tell us of women being dressed as mythical figures, Pasiphae, Dirce, even Danaids, and then subjected to staged assaults or gruesome deaths as the crowd watched. These spectacles blurred the line between punishment and entertainment, turning human suffering into theater. The fear this created was enormous. A Roman matron didn't just fear making a mistake. She feared being made into an example. Imagine living every day knowing that if you angered the wrong man or were accused of the wrong crime, your body might be put on display in the arena, your name cursed, your family ruined. The state thrived on this terror. Even poisonings, one of the most feared female crimes in Rome, carried punishments meant to terrify. Entire groups of women were sometimes accused at once, rounded up and executed publicly. In 331 BCE, according to Livy, more than 100 Roman women were executed for allegedly poisoning their husbands. Whether or not they were guilty hardly mattered. The Senate used their deaths as a warning, a message to every household that women who used poison to gain power would be destroyed. These punishments also served a political purpose. Emperors like Tiberius and Domitian weaponized accusations of sexual misconduct to get rid of rivals. If a senator's wife could be accused of treason or adultery, the whole family could be disgraced, their wealth confiscated, and their political power shattered. Women's bodies became the battleground for Rome's elite power struggles. But perhaps the most terrifying punishment wasn't public at all. It was private, secret, and left no trace. Some condemned women were taken to their deaths in silence, strangled or beaten in their own homes. their deaths reported as suicides to protect their family's honor. To the outside world, it looked like dignity. But everyone close to the case knew what had really happened. This silence was its own kind of horror, leaving survivors wondering how close they themselves were to the edge. Roman justice was never about fairness. It was about control, and punishing women in ways that terrified every other woman who saw it was one of its most effective tools. When we look at real Roman history, we see that some of the most infamous cases involved women whose fates became cautionary tales for the entire empire. Their lives and their deaths were turned into tools of propaganda, warnings about what happens when women stepped outside the lines Rome had drawn for them. Take Julia the Elder, the only biological daughter of Emperor Augustus. By all accounts, she was clever, charismatic, and beautiful, and perhaps a little too independent for Rome's first emperor. Julia was accused of adultery with multiple men, a crime that threatened not just Augustus's honor, but the stability of the imperial line. Augustus didn't just punish her quietly. He exiled her to the remote island of Pandateria, a rocky, barren place where fresh water was scarce and visitors were forbidden. She spent years there alone, stripped of her children and titles, slowly wasting away. The message was clear. Even the emperor's own daughter wasn't above Rome's moral code. Then there was Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, and one of the most scandalous figures in Roman history, at least according to the writers of the time. She was accused of everything from serial adultery to plotting to overthrow her husband. When the accusations became too great to ignore, Claudius ordered her death. But Messalina was given one last chance. She could take her own life, preserving some shred of dignity. Yet terrified, she could not bring herself to do it. A soldier had to finish the job for her. Her death was paraded as a lesson about female ambition, a narrative crafted to show that even an empress could be destroyed if she threatened Rome's patriarchal order. And then there was Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, a woman who wielded enormous influence and power behind the throne. She had survived poison attempts, plots, and political betrayals, but when her son decided she was a threat to his rule, he struck. Nero's first attempt was bizarre. He had her invited onto a specially designed boat meant to collapse and drown her at sea. When she swam to shore and survived, he sent assassins to her villa. Agrippina, realizing what was happening, reportedly told them to strike her in the womb, the very place that had given birth to Rome's emperor, as if to say, "This is where the threat began." Her murder was turned into a warning against women who tried to rule Rome from behind the throne. Even women who were not part of the imperial family could become targets of these brutal spectacles. In 42 CE, after a failed conspiracy against the emperor, dozens of noblewomen were executed alongside their husbands, not because they had acted, but because Rome believed that loyalty must be absolute, even within the household. Their deaths were meant to cleanse Rome of treachery, to show that no one, not even a senator's wife, was safe from imperial justice. What makes these cases even more disturbing is how they were remembered. Roman historians didn't just record these women's deaths, they embellished them, twisted them, turned them into morality plays. Julia became the symbol of decadent luxury, Messalina the archetype of sexual depravity, Agrippina the overreaching mother. Their stories were shaped to frighten other women into obedience. This wasn't just about justice, this was theater. Rome wanted every citizen, every woman, to feel the chill of fear when these names were spoken. These women became ghosts that haunted Roman society, forever reminding others of the price of stepping too far out of line. And as horrifying as these stories are, they are just the tip of the iceberg. Because Rome had punishments reserved not just for noble women, but for slaves, commoners, and foreigners. Punishments that were even more creative, more sadistic, and often designed to make the condemned suffer long before death finally arrived. If noblewomen like Julia and Agrippina could be cast aside and destroyed, imagine what happened to women with no wealth, no titles, and no one to defend them. For slaves, prostitutes, and captured foreign women, Roman justice could be unimaginably cruel, and it was often public. Rome believed that punishment should teach a lesson not just to the condemned, but to everyone watching. One of the most feared punishments for women of the lower classes was death by exposure, being tied to a stake or left chained in a remote place and simply abandoned. This wasn't a quick execution. The condemned might take days to die, baking in the heat or freezing at night, surrounded by wild animals. The slow process wasn't just about killing the woman. It was about turning her death into a warning for anyone who passed by. Even worse were the punishments for female slaves accused of conspiracy. Roman law held that if a master was murdered, every slave in the household, male or female, could be executed, whether they were guilty or not. In one notorious case in 61 CE, when a Roman prefect named Pedanius Secundus was killed by a single slave, over 400 slaves in his household were executed en masse. Women were dragged through the streets, publicly scourged, and then put to death simply because Rome believed collective punishment kept others from daring to rebel. Captured enemy women faced a different nightmare. After a rebellion or a conquered city, Roman soldiers often took the surviving women as spoils of war. Some were sold into slavery, but others were humiliated before being executed. In some cases, they were paraded through the streets in triumphal processions, displayed half-naked as living trophies of conquest. Afterward, many were strangled or clubbed to death as part of a ritual cleansing of Rome's victory. Public humiliation was also a common tool. Women accused of adultery or prostitution could be stripped, flogged, and marched through the streets, their hair cut short, a mark of shame in Roman culture. This wasn't just punishment. It was a spectacle meant to strip them of dignity before their final fate. And then there were the executions that were turned into entertainment, the cruelest of all. In the Colosseum and other arenas, condemned women were sometimes forced to participate in staged reenactments of myths or crimes. One account tells of women dressed as the sorceress Dirce being tied to a raging bull and dragged to death before a roaring crowd. Others were mauled by wild beasts in the arena, chosen specifically because their death would shock the audience. These spectacles blurred the line between justice and theater, reducing real women's pain to nothing more than a crowd pleaser. Even the manner of death could be carefully chosen for maximum terror. Crucifixion, usually reserved for slaves, was a slow, agonizing way to die, and women were not spared. Victims could take hours, sometimes days, to finally succumb, their suffering left on display as a grim warning. Others were burned alive, the fire meant to purify their crimes in the eyes of the gods. All of this points to one truth. Rome's punishments for women were not just about crime and justice, they were about control. By making examples of women, Rome reinforced its vision of order: obedient wives, silent daughters, loyal slaves. Any woman who threatened that order could find herself transformed into a gruesome spectacle. Her death a tool of social discipline, and the empire never stopped inventing new ways to terrorize. As we move forward, we'll explore the punishments so sadistic, so ritualized, that they were remembered for centuries. Punishments designed to make women suffer in ways that were almost unthinkable. If Rome's public spectacles were horrifying, its religious punishments could be even worse, because they were cloaked in ritual and solemnity, turning execution into something almost sacred. And nowhere is this more evident than in the fate of the Vestal Virgins, who broke their vows of chastity. The Vestals were Rome's most revered priestesses, charged with tending the sacred fire that symbolized the city's survival. They lived lives of privilege, free from the control of fathers or husbands, honored and feared by all. But with this freedom came a terrifying condition. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden even to lose their virginity. If a Vestal was discovered to have broken this vow, Rome considered it not just a sin, but a threat to the very safety of the city, and the punishment was chillingly unique. A Vestal could not be publicly executed. Shedding her blood would be a sacrilege, so the Romans devised a different death. The condemned priestess was taken to a small underground chamber, given a tiny lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of water, and sealed alive inside. There she would slowly starve to death, alone in darkness, her life extinguished as quietly as the sacred flame she had failed to guard. This ritual death was conducted in silence, with priests averting their eyes as the earth was shoveled over the entrance. It was not a chaotic execution. It was deliberate, solemn, and terrifyingly calm. Rome turned these women into living sacrifices, believing their deaths would appease the gods and restore divine favor. But Vestals were not the only women punished in religious ceremonies. Women accused of witchcraft, poisoning, or blasphemy could also face ritualized torture. In some cases, they were beaten with rods during a public festival as a symbolic cleansing. In others, they were drowned in rivers, their bodies offered to the gods. These punishments blurred the line between justice and ritual sacrifice, and reminded Roman women that their bodies were never fully their own, but belonged to the state and its gods. Even childbirth could become part of a ritual punishment. Roman law allowed fathers to expose newborn daughters they did not want, leaving them to die from cold, hunger, or animals. This was seen as an acceptable way to control the population and avoid the shame of raising an illegitimate child. Women who gave birth outside of marriage often faced not just disgrace but the death of their infants, turning motherhood into a cruel, public ordeal. And then there were the punishments that combined religious terror with public humiliation. Women convicted of adultery could be forced to stand naked before the altar of Venus, their hair shorn, while the community hurled insults or even refuse at them. The act was not simply punitive, it was symbolic, a ritual cleansing meant to strip away their impurity before they were either exiled or killed. These punishments reveal a deeper truth about Roman society. It wasn't enough to remove a woman who had broken the rules. She had to be turned into a warning, a living or dying sermon about the price of disobedience. Rome's religious rituals gave these deaths a sense of inevitability, as though the universe itself demanded that women suffer for stepping outside their prescribed roles. But the cruelty did not end there. In our next section, we'll explore the punishments Rome reserved for the most despised women of all, those accused of treason or betrayal, and how their deaths were designed not just to kill them, but to erase them from history entirely. When religion was not enough to control women, politics took over, and Rome was merciless when it came to women accused of treason, conspiracy, or betrayal. For these women, punishment was not simply about death. It was about erasure. One of the most chilling tools Rome used was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. If a woman was accused of treason or disgracing the imperial family, the Senate could vote to have her name struck from public records. Her statues would be smashed, her portraits defaced, her inscriptions chiseled away until it was as if she had never existed. This was more than death. It was a symbolic annihilation, a way to wipe out not just her body, but her legacy, leaving behind only silence. But often erasure came after brutal physical punishment. The wives of traitors, rebels, and disgraced senators were sometimes subjected to public beatings or forced to watch the executions of their husbands before facing death themselves. This was psychological warfare. Rome wanted these women broken in spirit before they were killed. The most infamous example comes from the reign of Emperor Tiberius, whose paranoia led to a series of purges. Noblewomen accused of adultery, conspiracy, or even idle gossip about the emperor were arrested and tortured for information. Some were flogged until they confessed, others driven to suicide. Those who survived interrogation might be paraded through the streets before being strangled or thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a cliff overlooking the Roman Forum, where traitors were hurled to their deaths. This punishment was especially feared because it stripped the victim of burial rights. In Roman belief, being denied a proper burial meant the soul would never find peace. To be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock was to be cast out not just from Rome, but from the afterlife. And still, some women were made into examples in ways that went far beyond death. Consider the fate of Lucilla, the sister of Emperor Commodus. After being accused of plotting against her brother, she was banished to the island of Capri, but exile was not mercy. She was eventually executed quietly, her body disposed of in secret so no one could mourn her. The message was clear. Rome controlled not just a woman's life, but even how she could be remembered. Sometimes the punishments were perversely creative. A condemned woman might be forced into slavery before execution, degraded and humiliated by being made to serve the very soldiers who guarded her. Others were mutilated, their tongues cut out, their noses slit, to ensure they could no longer speak or be seen as respectable Roman matrons before being killed. These punishments were designed with precision. Rome knew that the greatest power was not in killing quickly, but in destroying identity first. By humiliating these women publicly, by breaking their bodies and their names, Rome turned them into living warnings. It was not enough for them to die. They had to vanish from memory, leaving behind only fear. And yet some of these stories have survived, scraped together from inscriptions, whispered rumors, and hostile historians. They tell us that even in the most patriarchal of societies, women's lives and deaths were central to the drama of power. Rome's rulers feared rebellious women because they knew how much damage they could do. In the final part of this series, we'll look at the ultimate punishments, the ones that blurred the line between execution and torture, where women were subjected to deaths so slow, so gruesome, that they became theater for the masses and tools of terror that outlived the women themselves. If Rome's punishments for women were designed to control, then its most extreme executions were meant to terrify. These were not quick deaths, but spectacles, elaborate performances that turned pain into a message for the entire city. One of the most horrifying fates was execution in the arena, but not as a gladiator. Condemned women were sometimes used as living props in mythological reenactments, called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. In these spectacles, women were forced to play the role of mythological villains and were then slaughtered in front of the roaring crowds. A woman might be dressed as Dirce, the queen from Greek legend who was tied to a raging bull, and just like in the myth, she would be dragged to death across the sand as the crowd cheered. These executions were meticulously staged. Animals were starved for days to heighten their frenzy. Spectators would watch lions, panthers, or bears maul the condemned, their screams swallowed by the roar of the arena. The purpose was not simply to punish, but to entertain, to transform a woman's death into a public festival of blood. And if the arena was not available, there were punishments far more intimate and cruel. One of the most feared was being burned alive, a fate usually reserved for priestesses or women accused of sorcery. The pyre was not always meant to kill instantly. Sometimes green wood was used, so the fire would smolder and smoke, suffocating the victim slowly before the flames consumed her body. This was theater in its most sadistic form, a slow, ritualistic death, designed to show the gods and the people that justice had been served. For certain crimes, death by crucifixion was also inflicted upon women, though it was rare because of its perceived obscenity. Those chosen for crucifixion were considered the lowest of the low, slaves, rebels, or foreigners. To see a Roman woman hung on a cross was a powerful warning. No one, no matter how noble, was safe if they defied the state. Even more haunting were the punishments that turned women into living corpses before they died. Some were buried alive in small underground chambers, a slow suffocation in darkness, with no hope of escape. This fate was sometimes used for Vestal Virgins, who broke their vow of chastity. The state could not spill their blood directly, so instead it sealed them in a tomb with a small amount of food and water, leaving them to starve in the earth. Others were subjected to psychological torture before death. They might be kept in a cell where the executions of other prisoners took place within earshot, forced to listen to hours of screams and the sounds of flesh tearing, knowing they were next. By the time their moment came, they were already broken, their death a grim formality. The cruelty of these punishments reveals something unsettling about Rome. These were not mindless acts of savagery, but carefully orchestrated events meant to display the power of the state. Each lash, each scream, each drop of blood served a purpose, to remind the people that Roman order was absolute. And yet these women did not die quietly. Their stories survived in whispers, in records that slipped past censors, in fragments of history that refused to be erased. They remind us that Rome's greatness was built not only on law and glory, but on terror, and that women's suffering was one of its most powerful tools of control. As we look back, we cannot help but feel the weight of these stories. They are not just tales of death, but warnings from history, reminders of what happens when power goes unchecked, when fear becomes law, and when human suffering becomes entertainment. Rome may have wanted us to forget these women, but by telling their stories we make sure they will never be silenced again.